I always thought old age was like a long corridor, with the light bulbs going out with each step. When Janice went out, it was dark. 4 years have passed, and I still sometimes wake up and reach over to her side of the bed. Those 67 years stretch like rubber not torn, but stretched beyond recognition. The house greets me with creaks, like an old comrade in misery. We've both been through our better days. The house is almost 120 years old, inherited from my parents and theirs from my grandfathers. 3 generations of Slades have tramped the floorboards, worn down the steps, polished the railings. The red brick facade is tarnished by time, but it still stands strong, like a civil engineer's house. The phone rang, and I reluctantly rose from my chair. The morning coffee hadn't cleared the fog in my head yet, and an early morning call usually didn't bode well. "Hello," my voice sounded rougher than I intended. "Dad, it's me," Aiden's voice came through the phone. "My only son." "Well, the only one alive. I know it's you." "I have your name on my phone," I answered, wincing. Our conversations always start like this, awkward and strained. "Did something happen?" "Nothing happened," his voice sounded oddly enthusiastic. "Heather and I were thinking of coming to your place this weekend. Help with the roof. You said it was leaking, right?" I did mention the roof, but that was about 5 months ago when he called to wish me a happy birthday. I've only heard from Aiden a couple times since then. Short calls on holidays, the occasional health question. "Since when did you care about my roof?" I asked, not holding back the sarcasm. "Dad," I heard the familiar irritation in his voice. "We want to help. You can't handle a roof at your age." At your age. That phrase was a pain in the ass. I've built 32 bridges in my career, and now I can't handle my own roof. But something in his sentence made me hold back. "All right, come on over," I said at last. "There's plenty of room." As I hung up the phone, I thought about it. Aiden hadn't just come to my place for no reason in, how long? About 3 years. After Janice's funeral, he'd only shown up for a day or two, always with a specific purpose. Pick up my mom's jewelry for Heather, check on the deed to the house, help with the tax return. I knew Aiden didn't like this house. Too many memories, too many of my strict admonishments and inflated expectations. He had always lived in the shadow of his older brother Niels, the perfect son who had inherited my talent for building and my passion for bridges. Niels was to carry on the family business, and Aiden was always somewhere on the periphery, until Niels crashed in that damn car 15 years ago. I went up to the second floor to get the guest room ready. Heather was picky about cleanliness, though she never offered to help clean it herself. An annoying woman with perpetually pouty lips and the look of a pawn shop appraiser. There wasn't a drop of Janice's warmth or her acceptance and understanding. I hadn't given her a chance myself, though. When Aiden had brought her to meet me 7 years ago, I'd immediately seen her as calculating. Maybe that wasn't fair, but the first impression remained. The old sheet smelled musty, and I pulled a set out of the closet that Janice had saved for special occasions, one with hand-embroidered initials. Let Heather see that there was something special about this house, something she'd never have. I spent a few hours cleaning, dusting the dresser, washing the windows in the guest bedroom, even getting a vacuum to tidy up the carpet. It wasn't that I wanted to impress. I just didn't want to hear Heather whisper about how I'd neglected the house. By Friday night, I was exhausted. My joints were aching and my back was sore, but the house looked decent. I even took the time to stop by the store and buy groceries, real groceries, not the frozen food I usually eat. I bought steaks, potatoes, even a bottle of decent whiskey. Not that I was looking forward to this visit, but some part of me was intrigued. They arrived on Saturday around 11 o'clock. I heard a car pull up and looked out the window. Their silver SUV seemed inappropriately new and shiny against the backdrop of my old house. Aiden got out first, tall like me, but thinner, with thinning hair and glasses that always made him look like a perpetual student. Heather came out behind him, elegant even in jeans and a simple blouse, her blonde hair perfectly styled. I opened the door before they could knock. "Dad," Aiden hugged me awkwardly, patting me on the back. "You look good." It was a lie. I could see my reflection in the mirror, a haggard face with deep wrinkles, bags under my eyes, gray hair that I'd cut myself. "Hello, Barton." Heather smiled strainedly, making no attempt to hug me. "What an atmospheric house." Atmospheric, I repeated, letting them inside. That was a definition I hadn't heard before. They brought their bags and, to my surprise, bags of groceries. We thought we'd make dinner, Heather explained. You don't mind, do you? My house is your house, I said, not putting much warmth into those words. Aiden started looking at the roof right away, but in a superficial way, without real interest. Heather was walking around the house, ostensibly helping me clean, but I could see her studying every item, every picture on the walls, as if she were taking an inventory. That's a beautiful vase, she remarked, touching the Chinese vase Janice had found at a flea market early in our marriage. Antique, I lied, 18th century. Worth a lot of money. Her eyes sparkled for a moment, and she set the vase back down with newfound care. Interesting. By lunchtime, we were gathered around the table. Aiden opened the bottle of wine they'd brought, and we sat in awkward silence, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery against plates. How's your work going, Aiden? I asked, trying to start a conversation. It's fine, he shrugged. Same old stuff. Logistics, numbers. Nothing interesting. And your colleagues? You told me about Pierce. Pierce was transferred to another department, he said curtly, unwilling to continue the conversation. What about you, Heather? I turned to my sister-in-law. Still in the same dental office? Yes, she sipped her wine. Still the same. Administration, working with patients. There was silence again. I felt a familiar irritation. We sat there like three strangers who happened to be at the same table. After lunch, Aiden suggested we take a closer look at the roof. I went up to the attic with him, opened the hatch, and we climbed out. It was a clear, sunny day, and we had a view of Greenwood, a small town where everyone knew each other, where I'd lived all my life. Yeah, there's a real problem here, Aiden pointed to where the shingles were cracked. Does it leak a lot? Only when it rains hard, I answered, looking not at the roof but at my son. He looked tense, his eyes racing as if he couldn't concentrate. I can call the guys who did our roof, he suggested. They do good work, and the prices are reasonable. Thanks, but I can handle it. I know a roofer. Aiden nodded too quickly like he didn't care. We went downstairs and I noticed him whispering with Heather in the kitchen. When I walked in, they were abruptly silent. I was just telling Heather about the roof, Aiden explained hastily. It really needs some repairs. Uh-huh, I didn't comment. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Heather had made a surprisingly good dinner. The lasagna turned out delicious, though I would never tell her that. We sat in the living room with the TV on, hiding behind the news from having to talk. Have you checked in with the doctor lately, Dad? Aiden asked suddenly. Why? Just asking, he shrugged. You're not getting any younger. Neither are you, I snapped at him. I don't need a doctor. I'm fine. Prevention never hurts, Heather interjected with fake concern in her voice, especially at your age. There's that at your age thing again. They were talking about me like I had one foot in the grave. Maybe that's what they were expecting. I'll outlive you all, I grinned, and they exchanged quick glances. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard their voices from the guest bedroom. They spoke softly, but in an old house, sounds travel in strange ways. I couldn't make out the words, only the intonation. Tense, hurried. At night I lay awake, thinking of my son's strange visit. In the last few years we had grown so far apart that we were almost strangers. After Neil's death, something had broken in me, something I couldn't fix. I've always been a strict father, but with Neil's we understood each other. Aiden, on the other hand, had always been a mystery to me, with his books, his computers, and his strange hobbies. The next morning they came down to breakfast with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Heather was particularly animated, bustling about in the kitchen, making pancakes, though she'd never done that before. We have an idea, Dad, Aiden began as we sat down at the table. We could come over more often, help with the house. It's a big one for one. Why would you care so much? I asked bluntly. Aiden hesitated. We're worried about you. You're here alone, and the house needs care. I'm doing fine. I cut him off. You don't have to patronize me. We're not. Heather put her hand on his shoulder. We just want to be close. A family should stick together. I looked at them and saw the falseness in every gesture, every smile. Something they were up to, and that something had to do with my house. I noticed Heather looking appraisingly at the antique furniture, the paintings on the walls, the silver candlesticks Janice and I had bought in Europe years ago. They stayed all day, defiantly helping with minor repairs. Aiden replaced some shingles on the roof. Heather washed the windows in the living room. All the while I watched them, noticing their whispers, odd looks, unnatural smiles. As they were about to leave, Aiden asked, "We could come back next weekend to finish the roof. Would that be okay with you?" "Suit yourself," I replied indifferently. Heather hugged me goodbye, a gesture that seemed so insincere that I barely refrained from pulling away. When their car came around the corner, I went back into the house and sat down in my chair. Something was happening, something I didn't understand. But I felt it had to do with money, with an inheritance, with my house, and I didn't like it at all. Friday came all too quickly. All day I busied myself with preparations for my son and daughter-in-law's visit, though a strange uneasiness was growing inside me. Their last visit had left an unpleasant residue, as if I had missed something important, some key moment in their behavior. The house was cleaner than usual. I'd even steamed the old curtains in the living room and dusted the bookshelves, where for years no one had disturbed the ancient engineering volumes that had once been my passion. I boxed up the stacks of technical journals that had accumulated in the corner for decades and carried them down to the basement. I didn't want to hear Heather's comments about cluttering up my living space. Aiden called around 2 in the afternoon, saying they were delayed by traffic on the way out of town. "We'll be there around 6, he said without much apology in his voice. "Okay," I replied dryly. "Dinner will be ready." I made beef stew, the only dish I was really good at. Janice had taught me her recipe a month before she'd been diagnosed. It was like she had a premonition. Aiden and Heather arrived even later than promised, early 8. I met them at the door, not hiding my annoyance. "We were in an accident on the highway," Aiden explained, walking into the house. 3 cars. We had to stand for almost an hour." "That's a shame," Heather said, pulling off her light coat. "But the smell is delicious. Did you cook, Barton?" "No, I ordered it from the restaurant," I said sarcastically. "Of course I cooked." Heather pursed her lips but didn't say anything. I noticed Aiden shake his head slightly, as if urging her to ignore my rudeness. We didn't talk much at dinner. Aiden was talking about some problems at work, but it was so convoluted and full of corporate jargon that I quickly lost the thread. Heather inserted comments about her clinic, about difficult patients and greedy bosses. I nodded without listening. My thoughts went back to how weird they'd acted last time, and how weird they were acting now. After dinner, Aiden offered to drink the whiskey they'd brought as a gift. Expensive, judging by the packaging. I didn't refuse. We sat in the living room, sipping the amber liquid from old crystal glasses, a wedding present from my parents. "How's your health, Dad?" Aiden asked after the second glass. His eyes were a little unfocused. "I'm fine," I answered. "For my age." Heather sat beside him on the couch, her legs tucked under her. Her blonde hair seemed almost silver in the soft light of the desk lamp. "Do you see a doctor regularly?" Aiden continued with an insistence that seemed inappropriate to me. "When I need to." "What about the cardiologist?" Heather intervened. "With your family history—" "What do you know about my family history?" I interrupted. "Aiden told me that your father had heart problems." "My father died at 86, digging beds in the garden," I said dryly. "I don't think you need to worry." "Still, prevention is important," she insisted, "especially when you're alone." "I'm not alone," I retorted. "I have neighbors. There's Mrs. Patterson across the street who brings me pie every Sunday." "That's not the same as having family around," Aiden said softly. "Family?" I grinned. "You call once a month if you remember. You come over twice a year for a couple hours. And suddenly you care so much." There was a heavy silence in the room. Aiden lowered his eyes into his glass, and Heather straightened up, as if readying herself for defense. "Subramaniam, we're trying to work things out," she said with pressure. "Aiden's worried about you." "Worried," I repeated. "About me or about the house?" "Dad," Aiden looked up. Something like guilt flashed in them. "Don't start." "Don't start what? Telling the truth?" "You were never interested in me until you smelled the scent of inheritance." "That's not fair." Heather jumped to his feet. "We came here to help, and you—" "Shurna." "Heather!" Aiden grabbed her arm. "Don't!" She wrenched her hand away and walked out of the room, her heels clacking loudly on the wooden floor. Aiden finished his whiskey in one gulp and stood up as well. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Doing what?" "Pushing us away. Every time we try to get closer, you build a wall." "And you're trying to?" I raised an eyebrow. "Or are you just feigning concern?" He shook his head and followed his wife out the door. I was left alone in the living room, feeling old wounds reopen. I had been unfair. I knew it. But something in their behavior made me uneasy and suspicious. Later, as I walked up the stairs to go to bed, I heard muffled voices coming from the guest bedroom. I slowed my step, listening. The door was ajar, the old house, the floorboards creaking, the doors not closing tightly. "Ugh, I don't know why you're provoking him," Aiden's voice sounded angry. "I'm not provoking him," Heather replied. "I just can't pretend he isn't insufferable. Has he always been like this? This angry? He's not mean, he's complicated. After Mom died, it got worse. And after Neil's, always Neil's," she sounded annoyed. "Even now, after all these years, you still live in the shadow of a ghost." "Don't start," Aiden's voice sounded tired. "We agreed not to discuss this." "Okay," she changed her tone. "But what about the house? Have you talked to him about the will?" "Of course not," Aiden exclaimed. "I can't just ask, 'Hey, Dad, who are you going to leave the house to?'" I froze in place, my heart pounding. "So here's the thing. The house, my inheritance." "We need to know for sure," Heather insisted. "I saw the way he looked at me today. He hates me. What if he decides to leave everything to a charity? Or that old lady with the pies?" "He won't." Aiden's voice sounded uncertain. "I'm his only son." "His only living son," Heather corrected him. "But he always loved Neil's more. What if he left it all to some fund in Neil's name? Or a scholarship for engineering students?" There was a pause, and I imagined Aiden contemplating that possibility. It hurt me more than I'd expected. Did he really think I could disinherit him? "We need to be more careful," Heather continued. "Be nicer. He needs to think we care." "I do," Aiden objected, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Of course you do, dear," Heather said condescendingly, as if to a child. "Sereno, but let's face it, we need this house. This is our chance to get out of debt once and for all." "I know," Aiden sighed. "Besides, you saw him. He can barely walk. Dr. Reynolds said he won't last a couple of years with that pressure." Dr. Reynolds isn't his doctor," Aiden argued. "But you described the symptoms, the redness on his face, the shortness of breath, those angry outbursts, all signs of hypertension. Yeah, the house is almost yours and he's going to die soon." Those words hit me like a slap in the face. I recoiled from the door, feeling the blood rush to my face. They're discussing my death, counting on it, planning their lives on the assumption that I'll be gone soon. I walked back to my room on stiff legs and sat on the edge of my bed. My hands were shaking and my eyes were blurry. "He's going to die soon." The words rang in my ears, echoing. My own son and his wife are waiting for me to die so they can take possession of the house. I looked at the picture of Janice on the bedside table. She was smiling from the photo, young and beautiful, with our firstborn son Niels in her arms. The picture was taken the day we moved into this house. I was so full of hope then, so sure that I was creating a dynasty, that my sons would continue my work, live in this house, raise their children. Memories came in a wave. I remembered caring for my father in the last months of his life. He was lying in the very room where Aiden and Heather now slept, paralyzed from a stroke. I spoon-fed him, changed his diapers, read his favorite books aloud to him, even though I wasn't sure he understood a word. I shaved him every morning because I knew how important his appearance was to him. Mom died a few years before him, quietly and quickly. Cancer took her in 3 months. I was there for her until the end, holding her hand as she took her last breath. She left me this house and a command to keep my father safe. And now my own son is discussing my imminent death as a financial opportunity. The pain of this betrayal was sharper than I could have imagined. I lay on the bed without undressing. I couldn't sleep. The scraps of the overheard conversation swirled in my head, jumbled with memories. Was it my fault? I'd always been a strict father, demanding. When Niels died, something in me snapped. I remember that day. The call from the police, the identification of the body, the funeral. Aiden stood beside me at the grave, but I couldn't even put my hand on his shoulder, comfort him. My grief was too great, too personal. After that, I withdrew into myself. Janice tried to pull me out of that state, but to no avail. I distanced myself from Aiden, who was never like Niels, didn't have his talent for building, his passion for bridges and roads. Aiden was interested in computers, in numbers, in abstract things. I didn't understand it, couldn't accept it. When Janice died, the last thread that held us together was severed. I remember the funeral. Aiden stood on the other side of the casket with Heather, and there was a distance between us greater than the width of the grave. And yet, he's still my son, my flesh and blood. And now he and his wife are discussing my death as if it's just a matter of time, a convenient fact to lean on for financial planning. How long have they been waiting? A year? 2? Since Heather joined the family? Or before that? Maybe Aiden always thought I owed him for all the years I'd preferred Niels. I couldn't sleep. I got up and walked to the window. The moon was full, its light casting the orchard in silver. The apple trees I'd planted 30 years ago cast long shadows across the lawn. How many generations of Slades had picked apples from those trees? And would that tradition break on me? I remembered how Aiden had loved to climb the highest branches as a child, despite my inhibitions. One day he fell and broke his arm. Janice blamed me, said I was too hard on him, that he was climbing just to prove his bravery to me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I've always been too demanding, too critical. But does that justify what I heard today? Does that give them the right to calculatingly wait for me to die? I walked back to the bed and sat down. On the bedside table was the journal I'd started keeping after Janice's death. I didn't write regularly, just thoughts, memories, sometimes poems that came to mind. I opened it and began writing by the light of the nightlight. Today I learned that my son and his wife are waiting for me to die. They talked about it as mundanely as if they were discussing the weather. The house is almost yours. He will die soon. He is me. I am no longer a person to them, but an obstacle to inheritance. What have I done wrong? Where did I go wrong? Was I such a bad father that I deserved to be treated this way? Or was it the world that had changed, becoming more cynical and calculating? I remember Aiden climbing into my lap when he was 5 and asking me to tell him about bridges. I'd show him the drawings and he'd look at them with such admiration. When did that go away? When did that wall grow between us? I closed the journal, feeling not only pain but anger growing inside. Are they waiting for me to die? Think they can just sit out until the moment they inherit everything I've built and preserved for decades? Well, I'll teach them a lesson they'll never forget. I didn't sleep a wink all night. Thoughts circled in my head like vultures over a dying man in the desert. The house is almost yours. It will die soon. The words sank into me like poisoned hooks, and the more I tried to get rid of them, the deeper they penetrated. It was beginning to lighten outside the window. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the apple trees in the garden. The house was quiet, with only the old clock in the living room ticking away the time with its steady ticking. That clock had outlived 2 owners before me, and it would outlive me. And what will be left of my legacy? What will be left of me when my body is lowered into the ground? Images flashed before my eyes. Aiden and Heather selling off the furniture, throwing away my belongings, erasing all traces of my existence. Maybe they'd even tear the house down, build something modern in its place, or just sell it, turning 100 years of Slade family history into numbers in a bank account. Number. I'm not going to let that happen. Not like this. By 7 a.m., I had made my decision. I washed my face thoroughly, shaved, and dressed in my best suit, the same one I'd buried Janice in. An odd choice, but it seemed appropriate. I had to look serious, convincing. Going down to the kitchen, I started making breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon toast. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the house, and soon there were footsteps on the stairs. Heather was the first to appear, in a silk robe, her hair impeccably styled even from the morning. She froze in the doorway, staring in surprise at the set table. "Good morning," she said cautiously. "Morning." I tried to smile but felt my lips stretch unnaturally. "Coffee?" Heather nodded and sat down at the table, still wary. Aiden showed up a minute later in a t-shirt and house pants, sleepy, his hair disheveled. Dad. He looked at me in surprise, then at the table. Did you made breakfast? As you can see, I set the plates in front of them. Sit down, we need to talk. They exchanged quick glances. I noticed the worry in Heather's eyes as if she suspected I might have overheard their conversation last night. Aiden sat down across from me, his movements stiff. Did something happen, he asked, spreading butter on his toast. You could say that. I sipped my coffee, feeling the bitterness of the drink match the bitterness inside. I was at the doctor's yesterday, before you arrived. That was the first lie. I saw them both tense up. At the doctor's? Aiden interjected. You didn't say. I didn't want to bother you, I shrugged. Besides, you were on the road. What did the doctor say? Heather stared at me as if trying to read the truth in my face. I took a deep breath, as if gathering my strength, a theatrical pause that any actor would envy. A heart, I said at last, like my grandfather's. Left ventricular hypertrophy, ischemia, arrhythmia, the whole package. I rattled off medical terms I'd read in Janice's medical book. She was always health conscious, watching for every symptom. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to throw those books away. Oh God, Aiden breathed out. Is this serious? Enough, I shrugged again. Dr. King says I have about 6 months without surgery, maybe a year if I'm lucky. I watched their reactions, absorbing every micro-emotion. Heather froze, fork with a bite of scrambled egg frozen halfway to her mouth. Something flashed in her eyes, sympathy? No, more like calculation. She quickly pulled herself together and put the fork down. Barton, it's terrible. Her voice was sympathetic, but there was no real grief in it. What do they say about treatment? Surgery is possible, but risky at my age, I shook my head. The odds are 50-50, and that's if they find the right surgeon. Dad, Aiden looked shocked, but I could see something else rippling beneath that layer of shock. Relief? Anticipation? We need to find the best experts. I can talk to my colleagues. One of them has a wife who works at a cardiac center. That's not why I'm talking to you, I interrupted him. I need to get my affairs in order. In case, I paused again. Heather sat still, her fingers tapping lightly on the table, a sign of impatience. I want to revise the will, I said finally. Considering the circumstances, here it is. The word will hung in the air, electrifying the atmosphere. I could almost physically feel their attention focused, razor sharp. The will? Aiden repeated too hastily. Dad, this isn't the time to think about that. We need to focus on healing. It's a practical matter, I said calmly, like I was discussing the weather. I've always been a practical man, you know, and I want everything to be clearly agreed upon, with no arguments or misunderstandings later. But Aiden hesitated, obviously searching for words. You've already made a will, haven't you? After Mom died? Yes, but things changed. I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't realize I had so little left. What do you want to change? Heather's question was direct, almost tactless. I saw Aiden cast a warning glance at her, but she ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on my face. That's it, I answered simply. I've set up a meeting with Walter Griffin for tomorrow. You'll stay until tomorrow, won't you? Walter was the local notary and lawyer who had handled our family's affairs for the past 30 years. He drafted my previous will, which had actually given Aiden the house in most of my estate. Not that it was significant, but a house in a neighborhood like this was worth a lot. Of course we'll stay, Aiden said hastily. But Dad, don't you think you're in a hurry? Maybe we should get a second opinion first. These provincial doctors sometimes... Dr. King has been practicing for 40 years, I cut him off. I trust him more than I trust some metropolitan luminary who's going to look at me like I'm a purse with legs. I saw Aiden's face twitch. He'd always been bad at hiding his emotions. As a kid, I'd scolded him for it, said a real man should be able to keep a poker face. Nils could. Aiden never did. Okay, he said finally. If you're sure. I'm sure, I nodded. The meeting's at 10 in the morning. Walter's office on Main Street, you know where that is. Yeah, Heather smiled strained. We'll be there. After breakfast, they retired to the guest bedroom, ostensibly to change, but I could hear their muffled voices. They were arguing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was eloquent enough. Aiden was reprimanding Heather, and she snapped back. I walked out onto the porch and sat in the old rocking chair. The day promised to be clear, cloudless, and neighbor Mrs. Patterson was pruning the roses in her garden across the street. Noticing me, she waved. I waved back, thinking about the lie I had just spun and what I was going to do next. Maybe I'm doing the wrong thing? Maybe I should just talk to Aiden, find out what's going on. But then I remembered Heather's words. The house is almost yours. It's going to die soon. No, talking wasn't going to help here. They showed their true colors when they thought no one could hear them. Aiden came out on the porch a half hour later. He was pale, but he tried to stay calm. He sat down next to me and was silent for a while, looking out at the street. Do you remember when Niels and I built the fort here? He asked suddenly, pointing to the far corner of the garden, where 3 old oaks stood. I remember, I nodded. You used my best tools without asking. I was furious. Aiden laughed softly. Yeah, you told us off, especially me. Told me I should be smarter and not fall for Niels's adventures. I remember that day. The boys were 12 and 10. They had stolen my toolkit and tried to build something like a treehouse. It was crooked and askew, and when I saw them balancing on the rickety boards, my heart nearly stopped with fear. I yelled at them, especially Aiden, who was younger and should, by my logic, have been more careful. I've always been unfair to you, I said suddenly to myself. Aiden turned to me, surprised. What? I've been hard on you, tougher than I was with Niels. He didn't say anything, but I could see his shoulders tense. Niels was like me, I continued. It was easy for me to understand him. And you've always been different. I know, his voice was quiet. I was never good enough for you. It's not that, I shook my head. I just didn't understand you, and I didn't try to understand you. We fell silent again. It was an odd conversation for us. We usually avoided anything about feelings and past hurts. Dad, about the will, Aiden began gently. You don't have to change anything because of the diagnosis. Heather and I don't. I want things to be fair, I interrupted him. You're my only son. Everything should go to you. I watched his reaction. Relief, almost physically palpable, spread across his face. Dad, I'm not thinking about inheritance. He tried to sound sincere. I want you to be healthy. Of course, and I allowed myself a slight irony. But life doesn't always give us what we want. The evening passed in a strange atmosphere. Heather was unusually solicitous, making dinner, asking if I needed anything, if I was in pain. Aiden was quiet, thoughtful, often looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mixture of guilt, sadness, and some kind of childlike fear. I maintained the illusion. Every now and then, he rubbed his chest as if feeling the pain. Sometimes I stopped halfway through a word, as if I'd forgotten what I wanted to say. One time I even accidentally dropped my cup, pretending that my arm had suddenly weakened. Heather immediately rushed to pick up the shards, assuring me that it didn't matter, that what mattered was my health. I watched this spectacle with grim satisfaction. They were so obvious, so transparent in their fake concern, didn't even bother to hide their interest in my condition. Maybe we should move in with you for a while, Heather suggested over dinner, to help with the house, with the meds. No need, I shook my head. I have neighbors who look after me, and I'm not that infirm yet. But if the surgery, Aiden started. If I decide to have the surgery, we'll think about it, I said. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I couldn't sleep again that night. I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about tomorrow. I'd already called Walter, explained the situation. He was surprised but agreed to help. Walter had known me all my life, knew my father. He didn't ask too many questions, and for that I was grateful. The plan was simple. Tomorrow, in front of Aiden and Heather, I would make a new will that would leave the house and most of my savings to Aiden. I'll sign it in front of them. They'll be witnesses. And then after they leave, I'll meet with Walter again. I'll make a real will. I looked awful this morning. The sleepless nights had taken their toll. But for my part, it was a good thing. Heather made breakfast again, fussing over me, offering me blood pressure pills and herbal tea for my heart. Aiden asked if it would be better to reschedule the meeting with the lawyer if I wasn't feeling well. No, I was adamant. That's exactly why we need to settle this today, while I'm still able to think. We arrived at Walter's office at precisely 10 o'clock. His secretary, Miss Penny, greeted us with a professional smile and ushered us into the office. Walter, a tall, gaunt man with gray hair, looked exactly the same as he had 30 years ago. Just more wrinkles. Dash Barton, he shook my hand. It's good to see you. Though the circumstances aren't exactly pleasant. Thanks for seeing me on such short notice, I nodded. Walter said hello to Aidan and Heather and invited everyone to sit down. His office was austere, traditional dark wood, leather chairs, shelves of legal volumes. So, Walter began when we were seated. Barton told me on the phone that he wants to change the will. Is that a correct understanding of the situation? Yes, I nodded. Oh, and in light of my diagnosis, I want to make sure my estate is distributed accordingly. I understand. Walter opened a folder of documents. I have a copy of your previous will, made 4 years ago, after Mrs. Slade's death. According to it, your house and 80% of your financial assets go to your son, Aidan Slade. The remaining 20% goes to the Neil Slade Scholarship Fund at the Vermont College of Engineering. I saw Heather tense up at the mention of the 20% going to the scholarship. Aidan sat motionless, his face unreadable. I want to change the allocation, I said. The entire house and 95% of the financial assets should go to Aidan. The remaining 5% to the scholarship. Walter raised his eyebrows but said nothing. He was making notes on a piece of paper. Dad, it's not necessary, Aidan began. It's my decision. I was firm. The house should stay in the family. I want you and Heather to live here, to raise the kids. That's all I'm asking. Heather made a strange sound, something between a chuckle and a sob. She quickly pulled herself together, but I noticed her eyes sparkle. Whether it was joy or relief, it didn't matter. Any other conditions or requests? Walter asked, still taking notes. No, I shook my head. It's as simple as possible. I trust Aidan to handle the inheritance properly. Aidan looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Maybe deep down, he knew he was doing it wrong. Maybe somewhere underneath the layers of calculation and resentment, there was still love, or at least respect, for his father. All right, Walter nodded. We'll have the paperwork ready for lunch. You can come back at 2 o'clock to sign. We left the office. It was sunny and warm outside. Aidan suggested we walk to a local cafe. We had a few hours before the appointed time. At the cafe, Heather was unusually lively. She talked about her work, her vacation plans, even made a couple of jokes, something she'd never done before, at least not in my presence. Aidan was more reserved, but I could see him relaxing. The tension that had accompanied our meetings for years seemed to be dissipating. And that was the most disgusting thing of all, that it took the threat of my death and the prospect of an inheritance for them to start acting human. Dad, Aidan suddenly grew serious. I want you to know this. Regardless of the will and everything else, I love you. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you get the best treatment. I looked him in the eye. He looked sincere. Perhaps he even believed what he was saying. People are amazingly good at fooling themselves. I know, son, I allowed myself a softness in my voice. I love you too. And it was true. Despite everything, I loved him. He was my son, my blood, and that's why his betrayal hurt so deeply. At 2 o'clock, we went back to Walter's office. The papers were ready. I signed them in front of the notary, Aidan and Heather. Walter explained that the will would take effect immediately upon my death, without having to go through lengthy probate procedures. When everything was finalized, I felt a strange sense of relief. The first step had been taken. Now the real game was beginning. Thank you, Walter, I shook his hand, for everything. Always at your service, Barton. He nodded, and I saw understanding in his eyes. He knew this wasn't the end of the story. We walked outside. Aidan and Heather looked happy, despite trying to keep serious expressions on their faces. They suggested we stop at the pharmacy to get any medication we needed. Good idea, I agreed. And I'd also like to stop by the bank. I need to add your name to the safe deposit box access list, just in case. Sure, Dad, Aidan nodded seriously. Whatever you need. I saw him and Heather look at each other. There was anticipation in their eyes. They thought they'd won, that everything was going according to their plan. If only they knew that it was actually my plan that was just beginning to unfold. After their visit to the bank, Aiden and Heather became even more alert. Heather insisted on stopping by the supermarket to buy groceries for the week. Aiden volunteered to fix the squeaky porch step that had been annoying me for years. Their sudden concern would have been touching if I didn't know its true cost. 95% of my fortune. That evening, as we sat in the living room with tea, Aiden coughed awkwardly and said, "Dad, Heather and I have discussed and decided we should come over more often. Maybe even every weekend." "You don't have to," I waved him off. "You have your own life. I can handle it." "But with your condition," Heather began. "With my condition, I can live for a few more months without any problems," I interrupted. "You don't need to change your life before it's time." They looked at each other, and I could almost hear their thoughts. They didn't want to look too eager, but they didn't want to lose control of the situation either. "Still," Aiden insisted, "we'd like to be there for you. Help with the meds, the house." "Well, if that's what you want," I shrugged. "Just give me some advance notice. I don't like surprises." They left the next morning, loading the trunk and back seat of the car with bags of groceries, medicine, and vitamins. Heather even kissed me on the cheek goodbye, a gesture so unexpected that I barely restrained myself from wiping my face immediately afterward. "Take care of yourself, Barton," she said with fake tenderness, "and call me if you need anything." Aiden hugged me, and in that hug there was something of the old boy who used to run toward me when I came home from work. "Dad, it's going to be okay," he said. "We'll get through this." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Part of me wanted to believe his concern was genuine. But Heather's words, "The house is almost yours, it's going to die soon," rang in my ears, reminding me of reality. As their car disappeared around the corner, I went back into the house and sat down at the phone. It was time to act. The first call I made was to Walter Griffin. We were to meet again, but not in his office. Too many people knew me in town, and the news was spreading fast. "Walter," I said when he picked up the phone, "I need another meeting. Today, if possible, and not at the office. Is something wrong?" I could hear the concern in his voice. "No, everything's going according to plan, but we need a place where no one will see us together." Walter hesitated for a second, then said, "Come to my house at 6. Mary's gone to her sister's for a week, so no one will be in the way." "Thanks," I hung up, feeling relieved. The second call was more difficult. I found the number of Laura Benson, a lawyer from a neighboring town, in the directory. We didn't know each other personally, but I'd heard good things about her. Most importantly, she didn't know me, and she had no ties to Greenwood. "Laura Benson's office, legal services," a pleasant female voice answered. "Good afternoon," I said. "My name is Barton Slade. I need advice on an inheritance matter. Is it possible to meet with Miss Benson soon?" "Just a moment, I'll check my schedule." There was a pause. "Ms. Benson can see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Would that be all right?" "Yes, thank you." I wrote down the address and hung up. I spent the rest of the day organizing my papers. I took out of the safe all the papers related to the house, land deeds, insurance, bank statements. I laid them out on the desk in my office, studying each document, remembering the details. I needed to know exactly what I had before I started the game. The house was all mine, free of encumbrances and debt. The land was almost a hectare, a great asset in our small town, where there was hardly any free land left. I had a little over 200,000 in my bank accounts. Not too much, but not too little for a man who had worked as an engineer all his life. There were also shares in a few companies that I had bought little by little over the years, and a pension fund. All in all, a rather tempting inheritance for a greedy couple. At 6 in the evening, I arrived at Walter's house. His house was on the edge of town, an old Victorian mansion surrounded by tall oak trees. Walter met me at the door, his usually unruffled face expressing concern. "Come on in," he said, letting me inside. "In the study, where we won't be disturbed." Walter's office at home was an exact replica of his office. The same dark wood paneling, the same leather chairs, the same rows of law books on the shelves. Only there was an old gramophone in the corner and pictures of his family on the walls. So, Walter sat down at the table with his hands folded in front of him. "What's going on, Barton? And don't tell me you've suddenly developed a heart condition. I've known you for 40 years and you're healthier than many of my clients half my age." I smiled. Walter was always perceptive. I overheard a conversation, I said bluntly. Aiden and Heather were discussing my imminent death and how they would handle the inheritance. Heather said, "The house is almost yours. He's going to die soon." Walter whistled softly, his eyebrows rising. "Are you sure you got that right?" "Absolutely." They talked about me as an obstacle to money, discussed my health, speculated about how long I had left to live. Walter shook his head. "Unpleasant," he said after a pause. "But it's not a crime to wait for an inheritance. Lots of people do it. It's just that most people are tactful enough not to discuss it out loud." "I know," I nodded. "But it's more than that. All these years, they've barely bothered to call. Aiden never once asked how things were going, if they needed help. And now all of a sudden, you care so much." "What do you want to do?" Walter asked. "I want to make a real will," I answered. "A secret one. One to replace the one we signed yesterday." Walter frowned, his legal mind clearly assessing the situation. "It's possible," he said slowly. "A new will automatically overrides the previous one. But Barton, are you sure? This is your son, whatever his motives." "I'm sure," my voice was firm. "But I don't just want to disinherit them. I want to teach them a lesson." I outlined my plan to Walter. His eyebrows rose higher with each word, but he didn't interrupt me. When I was done, he was silent for a long time, drumming his fingers on the table. "This is unconventional," he said finally, "but legal if you do it right. Do you realize they'll be furious?" "I won't see that rage," I shrugged. "I'll be dead, at least to them." "What about afterward?" Walter asked. "Will you just disappear?" "I have a plan," I said, "but it's better if you don't know the details. That way you can honestly say you don't know where I am." Walter sighed. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's make a new will, but I still think you should think again." "I've been thinking about it for 2 sleepless nights," I replied, "and my mind is not going to change." We spent the next 2 hours drawing up the documents. Under the new will, the house and most of my financial assets would go to a foundation to be established to fund scholarships at the Vermont College of Engineering. The scholarships would be named after my oldest son, Neil Slade. To Aiden, I was leaving only a collection of old instruments that I had inherited from my father and $10,000, a token amount that would only emphasize his disappointment. When the papers were ready, Walter called 2 of his neighbors as witnesses. They signed the papers without knowing their contents. Standard practice for wills. "What now?" Walter asked when the witnesses left. "Now we wait," I said, "and I begin the next part of the plan." The next morning I went to meet Laura Benson. Her office was in a modern glass and concrete building, the exact opposite of Walter's old-fashioned office. Laura was a young woman, barely in her 30s, with a keen eye and an energetic way of speaking. She listened attentively to my story, a version I had prepared especially for her. "Mr. Slade," she said when I had finished, "if I understand correctly, you want to make it appear that you are selling off your assets and transferring the money to offshore accounts?" "That's right," I nodded. "It must look legitimate, but it must also look suspicious. May I ask why you're doing this?" There was no judgment in her voice, just professional curiosity. "Family matters," I answered evasively. "Let's just say I want to see if some people can be trusted." Laura gave me a studied look, then nodded. "Okay, I can help you with the paperwork, but I have to warn you that if we're talking about real offshore accounts, it might attract the attention of the tax authorities." "There will be no real transfers," I assured her. "Only documents that would look convincing to someone without a legal background." We discussed the details and Laura agreed to prepare the necessary papers by the end of the week. They would look like documents for transferring a large sum of money, almost all of my savings, to an account in an offshore bank. Back home, I started the next part of the plan. I made a list of the most valuable things in the house: antique furniture, paintings, silver, a collection of rare engineering books. Then I called Tom Randall, the owner of a local antique store. "Tom," I said when he picked up the phone, "I have a few things I'd like to sell. Can you stop by and appraise them?" "Sure, Barton," Tom replied. "When's convenient for you?" "How about tomorrow? Say 2 o'clock? I'll be at your place at 2. Tom agreed. I hung up the phone and smiled. The news that old man Slade was selling off the family heirlooms would spread through the city like wildfire. And Tom, for all his virtues, was a notorious talker. Aiden called that evening. His voice sounded concerned, but I could hear a note of control. "How are you, Dad? Taking your meds?" "Yeah, everything's on schedule," I lied. "I feel fine. I even started cleaning the house." "Cleaning?" I could hear the worry in his voice. "You don't have to work so hard. Maybe I should hire an assistant." "I don't need to," I cut him off. "It's a distraction, and I'm not going to spend money on strangers when I can still clean my own house." "Okay," he gave up too quickly. "Heather and I are thinking of coming over next Friday, if that's okay with you." "Suit yourself," I said indifferently. The door was always open. After the bell rang, I sat back in my chair, thinking about how quickly Aiden and Heather had taken on the role of caring relatives. I wonder how many times a day they discussed my condition and the prognosis for my imminent demise. Tom Randall arrived at exactly 2 the next day. He scrutinized the items I showed him, making notes in a small notebook. "A fine collection, Barton," he said when he had finished. "Especially the mahogany secretaire and the silver candlesticks. They're Victorian, if I'm not mistaken." Yes, I nodded. My parents brought them back from Europe before the war. "I could offer a decent sum for the whole collection," Tom said. "But are you sure you want to sell? They're family heirlooms." "I need money, Tom." I paused deliberately, as if hesitating to say more. "The doctors, you know, experimental treatments are expensive." Tom's eyes widened. I could almost see the story forming in his head that he would tell all his clients. "Oh," he coughed. "I understand. Of course, I'll give you the best price I can." We agreed he'd pick up the stuff in a week. I wasn't really going to sell them, but Tom didn't know that. The main thing was to get the word of the sale around town, and from there, to Aiden. I spent the next few days preparing the ground for my revenge. I withdrew a substantial amount of cash from my account, telling the bank the same story about the experimental treatment. I wasn't going to spend the money. I needed it as a prop for my play. I also began to gather evidence of Aiden and Heather's calculating nature. I recorded our phone conversation, where Aiden was overly insistent about whether I had visited the bank and made changes to the safe deposit box access, made copies of all documents related to the house and accounts, collected photographs of the most valuable items in the house, with dates on the back, proof that they'd been here before Aiden and Heather started their game. Laura Benson had sent the prepared documents via courier. They looked impressive. Official letterhead, stamps, signatures. To the layman, they seemed perfectly legitimate. They said that $180,000 had been transferred to a bank account in the Cayman Islands. I put the documents in an envelope and hid them in my office in a desk drawer, carelessly enough that a curious person could easily find them, but not so obviously that it looked like a trap. On Thursday night, the day before Aiden and Heather arrived, I made the final preparations. Pulled out an old safe that had been in the pantry for years. It was heavy, metal, with a combination lock. I put it in my office, in a prominent place. Inside, I put some of the cash I'd withdrawn, documents from Laura Benson, and a notebook with fictitious notes about meetings with financial advisors and overseas contacts. The code to the safe, Neil's birthday, I wrote down on a small card and put it in the drawer of my bedside table. Obvious enough that Aiden or Heather would find it if they were looking for it. Finally, I wrote a letter and put it in an envelope labeled "To Aiden," to be opened after my death. I placed the envelope in the safe, on top of all the other documents. Everything was ready. Now all I had to do was play my part to the fullest. Aiden and Heather arrived Friday night, laden with bags of groceries and medicine. Their concern would have seemed touching if I didn't know its true cost. "Dad, you've lost weight," Aiden remarked, hugging me. "Are you eating well?" "I'm fine," I mumbled. "I just don't have an appetite." "I'll make your favorite meat pie," Heather suggested. "We need to keep our strength up." I noticed them looking around the living room, noting the absence of certain things, the silver candlesticks on the mantel, the antique clock on the wall. "Dad," Aiden began cautiously, "where's the clock? The one that was hanging over the fireplace?" "Sold it," I shrugged. "And one other thing. Tom Randall gave me a good price." "Sold it?" Aiden couldn't hide his surprise and dismay. "Why?" "I need the money," I answered simply. "Treatments are expensive, especially the one I found." "What kind of treatment?" Heather stepped closer, her eyes narrowed. "Dash experimental therapy," I was deliberately vague. "In Europe. The results are promising, but insurance won't cover it. Why didn't you tell us? Aiden sounded hurt. We could have helped. You're doing enough. I dismissed it. It's my decision and my money. All evening they were tense. I saw them exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. After dinner, as Heather was washing the dishes, Aiden took me aside. Dad, I'm worried, he said quietly. Are you sure this therapy is legal? I don't want you to be fooled. I wasn't born yesterday, I snapped back. I've checked it out. I've already made the first installment. How much? He asked bluntly. Huh, 30,000 to start, I said, the amount large enough to cause alarm. The full course costs about 200. Aiden went pale. 200,000? Dad, that's almost all of your savings. So? I looked him straight in the eye. That's my money and my life. Later, I accidentally left the office door open when I went to bed. The safe was in plain sight, massive and mysterious. I could almost physically feel Aiden and Heather's curiosity, their desire to know what was inside. In the morning, I woke up earlier than usual and quietly made my way downstairs. As I'd expected, my desk drawer was slightly pulled out, not the way I'd left it. They had found the papers from Laura Benson. I smiled. The performance had begun. In 2 weeks, my house had become a theater of the absurd. Aiden and Heather started calling every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times. Their voices in the phone oozed fake concern, behind which I sensed a growing panic. The paperwork to transfer the money to an offshore account did the trick. Dad, how are you feeling today? Aiden asked me every night. So, I answered, adding a husky, weak tone to my voice. The doctors say it takes time for the therapy to take effect. Are you sure this therapy is working? He sounded worried. Maybe we should get a second opinion. I've already paid for it, Aiden. I paused between words as if I was having trouble speaking, and started the course. It's too late to change anything. After our conversations, I wrote everything down in my journal. Every question, every intonation, every pause. Documented their growing panic with the cold methodicality of a scientist observing an experiment. On Wednesday, 10 days after their last visit, Aiden called with an unexpected offer. Dad, Heather and I are thinking of coming up for the weekend. We'll bring you some home-cooked food, see how you're doing. No need, I purposely made my voice sound weak. I'm fine. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, comes by every day. We'll come anyway, Aiden insisted. You don't sound not good. We'll feel better if we can see you. I agreed, hiding a smile. The plan was working perfectly. After the call, I went down to the basement where the old family albums were kept. I found pictures of Aiden as a child, a smiling boy on his bike, fishing with his father at his high school graduation. These pictures triggered an unexpected wave of nostalgia. We'd once had a normal relationship before Niels died, before grief and resentment put a wall between us. I pushed those thoughts away. Sentimentality was inappropriate right now. Instead, I took the last pictures of us with Aiden and Heather at Janice's funeral, with tense faces and empty eyes. Put them next to the baby ones. The contrast was stark, like 2 different people, 2 different lives. The next day, I visited the bank and withdrew another $30,000 in cash. The manager, Mr. Pollock, looked worried. Mr. Slade, that's the second large withdrawal in a month, he said, lowering his voice. Are you sure it's safe? Absolutely, Henry, I smiled at him. Just a little restructuring of assets. If anyone bothers you or, he hesitated, is forcing you to do something, you can tell me. We'll contact the appropriate authorities. Henry's concern touched me. We'd known each other for 30 years. Our kids went to the same school. It's nothing like that, I shook my head. Just new investment opportunities. I'm not getting any younger, you know. Gotta try new things. He nodded uncertainly and handed me the money. As I left the bank, I noticed Elsa Jameson, the local gossip columnist who was clearly watching me. News of my financial manipulations would spread through the city by tonight, and by tomorrow it would reach Aiden, if not directly, then through mutual acquaintances. At home, I hid the money in the safe, leaving the envelope with part of it in my desk drawer, careless enough to be easily found. Then I sat down at my computer and opened several websites about cryptocurrency without deleting my browser history. I printed out a few articles about Bitcoin and Ethereum, underlined key points, and made notes in the margins. I left these papers in plain sight too, on the coffee table in the living room. In the evening, Heather called, the first time she'd called alone, without Aiden. Barton? Her voice sounded unusually soft. How are you feeling? As good as I can be, I added weakness and a slight cough to my voice. Aiden is very worried, she paused. We're both worried. Are you sure this European clinic is reliable? Dash reliable enough? I was being deliberately vague. They have good references. It's just... She hesitated. Aiden had talked to several cardiologists here, and no one had heard of this therapy. It's experimental, I tried to sound annoyed. That's why it's so expensive. Look, Heather, I appreciate your concern, but it's my decision. Of course, she backed off quickly. We just want to make sure you're not being scammed. After the conversation, I made another journal entry. Heather called today, first time alone, trying to find out about the money under the guise of concern for my health. They've obviously found the offshore documents and are now in a panic that the inheritance is slipping through their fingers. The next day, I met with Walter Griffin at his home. He handed me the final version of my present will, certified and legally flawless. Are you still sure about this? Walter asked as I looked over the document. More than sure, I nodded. They're getting more and more intrusive, calling every day, coming in on weekends. Yesterday, Heather questioned me about the clinic as if I were a child who couldn't make decisions. Walter shook his head. You know, maybe they really do care about you. Not just about the money, I looked at my old friend with a sad smile. I'd like to believe that, Walter. I really would. But you didn't hear Heather say, he's going to die soon, with such anticipation in her voice, as if I wasn't a person anymore, just an obstacle to inheritance. Walter sighed and held out a pen to me. I signed the document, feeling oddly relieved. No matter what happened next, my true last wishes would be honored. The will be kept in my safe, Walter said. No one will know about it until the time comes. Thank you, I shook his hand, for everything. When I got home, I found 3 missed calls from Aiden. I didn't call him back. Let him be nervous. Friday night, they arrived as promised. Aiden looked tense with a shadow of sleeplessness under his eyes. Heather was reserved and friendly, but I could see her gaze sliding around the room, noting the absence of a few more things I'd sold. Dad, you've lost weight, Aiden said, hugging me. Are you sure you're eating normally? I had indeed lost weight in recent weeks, deliberately restricting myself from eating to give the impression of declining health. My clothes hung on me like hangers. My cheeks were sunken, and there were shadows under my eyes, the result of sleep deprivation and stress. But from the outside, it looked like signs of illness. It's fine, I shrugged. Just no appetite, a side effect of the medication. What medication? Heather asked. You didn't tell us about the new meds. The ones the clinic prescribed, I was being deliberately vague. Part of the therapy. I noticed them exchange quick glances. Distrust, anxiety, irritation. All of it flashed in their eyes in a split second. That evening at dinner, Aiden finally dared to ask a direct question. Dad, I talked to Mr. Pollock at the bank. He said you've withdrawn almost all of your savings. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth, then slowly lowered it. Did you talk to my banker about my accounts? Aiden had a right of access to the information as a trusted person named in the documents. But the mere fact that he'd exercised that right spoke volumes. I'm worried. He looked guilty but insistent. These overseas transfers, cash withdrawals. Dad, it looks suspicious. It's like someone's cheating you. No one's cheating me, I said quietly with pressure. I know what I'm doing. But this therapy, Heather began. Not just therapy, I interrupted. I've decided to diversify my investments. I've discovered new opportunities. What kind of opportunities? Aiden tensed. Cryptocurrency, I said, watching their reactions. Bitcoin, Ether, the future of finance. Heather choked on her wine and Aiden went pale. Crypto. Dad, are you serious? That's speculation. It's pure risk. Who put you up to this? No one, I shrugged. I decided to do it myself. I read about it, studied the charts. It's very promising. How much? Aiden asked me directly. How much did you put in? Enough, I smiled enigmatically. And so far, the results have been encouraging. After dinner, they retired to the guest bedroom. I could hear their muffled voices. They were arguing. Heather, judging by the tone, was accusing Aiden of losing control of the situation. Aiden snapped back. I rose to my feet, feeling oddly satisfied. They'd taken the bait. Now all that was left was to hook them and pull them to shore. I spent Saturday defiantly not feeling well, coughing, holding my heart, laying down to rest a few times. Aiden and Heather fussed around, offering pills, tea, or to call a doctor. I refused everything, saying it was just a temporary aggravation, part of the treatment process. While I was resting in the afternoon, they searched the house. I purposely left the bedroom door ajar and could hear them quietly walking around the study, opening drawers, rustling papers. I wondered if they had found the code to the safe. Had they opened it? In the evening, Aiden came up to me as Heather was doing the dishes. Dad, he began cautiously, I found an envelope of money in your desk. A lot of money. It's not safe to keep that much cash at home. Do you go through my desk a lot? I asked him pointedly. He blushed, but he didn't back down. I was looking for your prescriptions. I wanted to check the dosage of your medications. That's a good excuse. Prepared in advance. The money's safe, I said. Don't worry. But why do you need it? That much? I have my own plans, I looked him in the eye, which don't concern you. They were leaving on Sunday. Heather prepared food for the week ahead, arranged the containers in the refrigerator with signed instructions. Aiden fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom and tightened the loose banister on the stairs. All the while, they continued to watch me surreptitiously, noting every cough, every awkward movement. Before we left, Aiden suggested, maybe we should stay a couple more days. You don't look so good. No need, I shook my head. You have your own life, your own work. I can handle it. We can come back next weekend, Heather said, or sooner if we need to. Just call. I promised I'd call if I needed help. They left reluctantly, glancing around as if they were afraid I'd drop dead as soon as their car turned the corner. When they left, I returned to the house and went straight to the study. As I expected, the papers in the drawers had been slightly moved, and the safe was open. They had found the code and couldn't resist the temptation. Everything inside was in place except for one thing, an envelope labeled, "To Aiden," to be opened after my death. They hadn't touched it, but they'd obviously noticed it. I smiled, another bait thrown. I spent the next week finalizing my preparations. Called a few old friends and coworkers I hadn't talked to in a while and made appointments. I bought new clothes, a few sizes smaller than usual, to enhance the weight loss effect. I ordered several books on cryptocurrency online and left the receipts and packaging in a conspicuous place. Aiden called every day, sometimes several times. I answered every once in a while, saying in a weak voice that I was feeling normal considering the circumstances. One time I deliberately didn't answer 3 calls in a row, and then when he called back the 4th time, he said he was asleep after taking his medication. Maybe we could come over on Wednesday, he suggested, not hiding his anxiety. To check on you? No need, I mimed a cough. I'm fine, and I've got Mr. Griffin coming by on business. Walter? Aiden's alert. What's your business with him? Just routine. I paused deliberately, as if I were having trouble speaking. House deeds, insurance. Nothing important. After the conversation, I wrote in my journal, Aiden's in a panic. Mention of Walter's visit almost gave him a heart attack. Is he afraid I'm changing my will? Or that I'll sign the house over to someone else? If only he knew the truth. Wednesday, just like I told Aiden, Walter showed up. But not for routine business, but to discuss the final details of my plan. It's done, I told him as I poured the whiskey into glasses. All that's left is the final act. Are you sure you want to see this through? Walter looked worried. It's not too late to stop. It's too late, I shook my head. They'd gone too far. Going through my things, checking accounts, opening the safe without authorization. It's not just waiting for an inheritance anymore. It's actively interfering with my life. Walter sighed, but he didn't argue. He knew me well enough to know that once I'd made up my mind, there was no changing my mind. Well, he said, raising his glass. To justice, however bitter it may be. To justice, I nodded, and we drank. Thursday night, Aiden called again. This time I didn't pretend to be weak. Instead, I spoke in a cheerful voice. talking about my plans for the weekend, about going to a neighboring town on business. Are you going somewhere? Aiden wondered. Alone? In a car? Yeah, a little business, I said casually. Nothing serious. What kind of stuff? His voice sounded tense. Personal, I cut him off. Manan, don't worry, I'm healthy enough for a little trip. After the conversation, I wrote one last note in my diary. Everything is ready. Tomorrow the final act begins. I wonder how fast they'll arrive when they find out about my accident. And how will they feel when they find the envelope in the safe? I closed the diary and put it in my desk drawer. This diary would be part of the evidence I would leave behind for Aiden and Heather. Evidence that I knew of their plans and motives from the beginning. Now all I had to do was wait for the right moment for the final act of my play. And that moment was at hand. On Saturday, exactly 3 weeks after I overheard my son and daughter-in-law talking, I put my plan into action. The day was overcast with low clouds and drizzling rain. Perfect weather for the final act of my play. I waited until 6 p.m. when most of the neighbors returned from their Saturday shopping. Then I went out on the porch and, after making sure Mrs. Patterson was working in the garden across the street, started up the stairs to the second floor. On the penultimate step, I deliberately tripped, let out a loud groan, and fell with a clatter, rolling down the few steps back to the bottom. The pain was real. I'd miscalculated and hit my hip harder against the railing than I'd intended. But that only added credibility to my performance. I lay at the foot of the stairs, breathing hard and moaning loud enough for Mrs. Patterson to hear through the open window. The plan had worked perfectly. 2 minutes later, there was a knock on the door and the excited voice of the neighbor. Barton? Barton, are you all right? I heard a noise. Help me, I said, pain and fear in my voice. I fell. I can't get up. The door was unlocked and Mrs. Patterson ran into the house. Seeing me on the floor, she awed and immediately pulled out her cell phone. Calling an ambulance, she said, dialing the number. Don't move, Barton. I closed my eyes, letting things take their course. The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later. The paramedics examined me, checking my blood pressure and pulse, asking the standard questions about chronic illnesses and allergies. Heart, I wheezed. I'm having heart problems, and I'm dizzy. This was a key point. I needed to be taken to the hospital, not just treated locally. Mentioning my heart problem did the trick. The paramedics looked at me and decided to transport me for a more thorough examination. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I asked Mrs. Patterson, "Can you call my son, please?" The number's in the notebook on the hall table. She promised to contact Aiden immediately. The plan worked like clockwork. At the hospital, I was admitted to the emergency room. The doctors ran the standard tests, EKG, blood work, checked my pupil response. I complained of dizziness and chest pain, but did so subtly enough not to raise suspicions of simulation. Mr. Slade, the initial test results don't show a heart attack, the young doctor said, reviewing the data. But given your age and symptoms, we'd like to keep you under observation at least until morning. Of course, doctor, I mimed resignation. Whatever you say. I was transferred to a room. I lay on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Aiden should have been here within 2 hours if he'd left right after Mrs. Patterson called. Time dragged slowly, the minute hand on the wall clock seeming to freeze between divisions. At the beginning of 9 o'clock, there was a hurried knock on the door, and Aiden literally flew into the room. His face was pale with anxiety, his hair disheveled, his glasses askew, as if he'd put them on in a hurry. Dad! He rushed over to the bunk. What's wrong? Heather came in after him, more restrained, but also with a look of concern on her face. I fell down the stairs, I said in a weak voice. I got dizzy and I just fell. What did the doctors say? Aiden took my hand and I felt his fingers shake. They haven't found anything serious yet, I shrugged slightly, and then gave a grimace of pain. But they're keeping me for observation until morning. Heather stepped closer, her gaze sliding over the monitors and medical charts. Could it have something to do with your condition? She asked cautiously. It could be. I pretended to find it hard to speak. Dr. King had warned me about possible complications during therapy. Aiden squeezed my hand tighter. We'll stay with you. All night if you need to. Not necessary, I smiled weakly. but there's something I wanted to ask. Anything, Dad. Aiden stepped forward. I need the documents from the safe in my office. The blue folder on the top shelf, and I paused as if I was having trouble concentrating. The envelope with your name on it. The one I asked you not to open before I died. Aiden tensed, his eyes widening. Why do you want it now? I want to look through it. I closed my eyes, feigning exhaustion. Just in case, if something happens. I want to make sure everything's okay. Nothing's going to happen. Aiden clenched his teeth. You'll be fine, and you'll come home. Of course, I nodded weakly. But bring it anyway. The code to the safe. I know the code, Aiden said quickly, and then realized his mistake. I opened my eyes and looked at him in mild surprise. You do? How? You? He hesitated. You mentioned it once. Ah. I closed my eyes again, pretending to believe him or to be too weak to argue. Okay, then bring the paperwork in the morning when you get here. I can go right now, Aiden offered. It's not far. I'll be quick. Whatever you want, I said with a wave of my hand. Just take your time on the road. I'm not going anywhere. Aiden looked over at Heather. She nodded and he stood up. I'll be right back. Heather will stay with you. When the door closed behind him, there was an awkward silence in the room. Heather sat down in the chair beside the bed, her hands nervously fumbling with the strap of her purse. Barton, she began cautiously, you gave us quite a scare. When your roommate called, I know, I nodded weakly. I'm sorry, it was stupid. The old man on the stairs is a classic story. She tried to smile, but it was unconvincing. Her eyes kept returning to the monitors, as if she were trying to read the truth about my condition. How are you really feeling? She asked suddenly. Honestly, I looked into her eyes with a long stare. Honestly, tired, Heather, really tired. She nodded, taking that answer at face value. If she'd known exactly what I was tired of, their lies, their waiting for me to die, their fake concern, she wouldn't have sat so still. We barely spoke until Aiden came back. He showed up an hour later, out of breath, with a blue folder and an envelope in his hands. His face looked strange, tense, almost frightened. Here, Dad. He handed me the papers, and I could see his hands shaking. Everything you asked for. I took the folder and the envelope, nodding my thanks. The envelope was unopened, at least it looked that way, but I could tell by the look on Aiden's face that he'd opened it, read the contents, and then sealed it back up. Thank you, son. I put the papers on the bedside table. Now I could be calm. Aiden sat down in the chair next to Heather, and they exchanged quick glances. Something changed in the atmosphere. There was a new tension, almost palpable. Dad, Aiden began after a long pause, his voice sounding strange. I have a confession to make. What is it? I faked a mild look of bewilderment. Yeah? He swallowed. I opened the envelope. I'm sorry, I know you said not to open it before you died, but I was worried that I'd leave all my money in cryptocurrency or move it offshore. Yeah, I finished for him, and my voice was suddenly harder than I'd been pretending to be for the past 2 hours. Aiden flinched, his eyes widening. You knew? All this time? Of course I knew. I sat up slowly on the bunk, straightening up. I knew from the beginning. What do you mean? Heather looked from me to her husband, clearly not understanding what was going on. Show her. I nodded at the envelope. Let her read it, too. Aiden pulled a folded piece of paper out of the envelope and handed it to his wife. She unfolded it, and her eyes slid quickly over the lines. I knew every word in that letter by heart because I had written it myself. Dear Aiden, if you are reading this letter before I die, it means you have violated my request and opened the envelope early. However, I was expecting it. I heard your conversation with Heather in the guest room 3 weeks ago. Yes, the house is almost yours. It will die soon. Those words will stay with me forever. I don't have heart disease. No experimental therapy in Europe. No offshore accounts and cryptocurrency investments. It was all a test of your true nature, which you failed miserably. This will has been drawn up and is in Walter Griffin's possession. It transfers the house and all my savings to a foundation that will pay scholarships to students at the Vermont College of Engineering, the Niels Slade Scholarship. All I'm leaving you, Aiden, is my father's toolkit, so you can build your own house instead of waiting for me to die. Barton Slade. When Heather finished reading, her face turned white as chalk. She looked up, eyes full of shock and disbelief. Is this a joke? Her voice shook. No, I shook my head. Not a joke. Were you eavesdropping on us? Aiden looked stunned. The door was ajar. I shrugged. And you weren't exactly trying to be quiet? Heather jumped to her feet, her face contorted with rage and shame. You've been playing games with us this whole time? Pretending to be sick? Making us worry? This is cruel. Cruel. I raised an eyebrow. Anatan, what do you call discussing my imminent death as if it were a happy event? Aiden sat with his head down, his shoulders slumped. Dad, you don't understand. We didn't want you dead. It's just, Heather misspoke. Bad choice of words? I let out a short laugh. He's going to die soon is a pretty unambiguous expression, don't you think? We were worried about you, Aiden insisted, but his voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. You were worried about the inheritance, I corrected him, and you proved it with your behavior. The sudden visits, the phone calls, the concern. It was only after we talked about the will. Before that, you'd barely bothered to call it Christmas for years. Heather stood at the window with her arms crossed over her chest, her back tense. What now? She asked without turning around. You're just disinheriting Aiden? For one sentence? Not for a phrase, I shook my head. For years of neglect, for fake care, for seeing me not as a person, but as an obstacle to money. Aiden raised his head, tears glistening in his eyes. That's not fair. Yes, we talked about the inheritance. Yes, we were waiting for, he stammered. But that doesn't mean we don't love you. You're my father no matter what. The words hurt something inside me, but I didn't let myself soften. Love is proven through actions, Aiden, not words in a hospital room when you think your inheritance is slipping through your fingers. There was a heavy silence in the room. Aiden stared at the floor, Heather at the window, and I watched them both, feeling a strange emptiness inside. I'd expected revenge to bring satisfaction, but now I felt only fatigue. So you're not sick, Aiden said finally. Was all of this an act? Yes, I nodded. So was your sudden concern. Heather turned sharply, her eyes flashing. You're a monster, she spat out. Making us think you're dying, playing on our feelings. Feelings? I grinned. What feelings, Heather? Fear of losing your inheritance? The disappointment that my money is going somewhere else? It's not feelings, it's greed. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I don't have to listen to this. Aiden, I'm waiting for you in the car. When the door closed behind her, Aiden and I were alone. He looked broken, aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. You really don't think it's too much? He asked quietly. To deprive me of everything because of one conversation? Not because of a conversation, I shook my head. Because of everything that came before and everything that came after. Aiden, you and Heather didn't even deny that you were waiting for me to die for the inheritance. You're just trying to justify it. He was silent, and there was more recognition in that silence than in any words. What are you going to do? He asked at last. After you leave the hospital? Move away, I shrugged. Start a new life, somewhere far away from here. You're going away? He looked surprised. Where? That's none of your concern, I said without anger, just stating the fact. I'll be dead to you and Heather. You'll get what you've been waiting for, but without the inheritance. Aiden stood up, his movement slow, as if every muscle was fighting back. And you think this will make you happy? This revenge? No, I answered honestly. But at least it would be fair. He walked towards the door but stopped with his hand on the knob. You know, I really loved you, he said without turning around. Despite the fact that you always preferred Nils, despite years of criticism and resentment, I tried to be a good son. Perhaps, I nodded, but not hard enough. He walked out without another word. When the door closed, I leaned back against the pillows and closed my eyes. A strange desolation swept over me. I had won, but it was a bitter victory. An hour later, the doctor came into the room. How are you feeling, Mr. Slade? Better. I sat up on the bunk. Much better. I think I'm ready to be discharged. He frowned. I'm not sure that's such a good idea. We were planning to observe you until morning. I feel fine, I insisted. And I have urgent business to attend to. I'll sign any paperwork that relieves the hospital of liability. The doctor reluctantly agreed, and 2 hours later I was free. Walter Griffin was waiting for me in the parking lot, just like we agreed. Did everything go according to plan? He asked as I got into his car. Yes, I nodded. They'd learned their lesson. So what now? Now I disappear. I buckled my seatbelt. Just like I planned. We drove not to my house, but to a small cottage on the outskirts of a neighboring town that Walter had helped me secretly rent 2 weeks ago. All the necessary things and paperwork for my new life were already there. Are you sure you want to do this? Walter asked as we pulled up to the cottage. To disappear? To start over at your age? Yes, I nodded. There's nothing keeping me here. We said goodbye, and I walked into my new home, small but cozy, overlooking the river and mountains in the distance. It was a new beginning, with no past, no disappointments, no betrayals. Aiden and Heather would return to the empty house, find a copy of the real will on the living room table, and realize that everything I'd said in the hospital was true. The house and the money will go to the Neil's Scholarship Fund. Aiden will get his father's old tools, and a lesson that will hopefully make him think about his life. I sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the sunset. Revenge had been accomplished, but there was no joy. Only the quiet certainty that justice had been served, albeit in a bitter way. Old age is indeed like a long corridor where the light bulbs go out with each step. But I decided to walk the rest of the way alone, without looking back at those who were waiting for me to disappear into the darkness.